Good afternoon and most welcome to H814. I'm presently at the small block library in Lindome, about 20 or 25 kilometers south of Gothenburg. It's been a very warm day, unusual for the season, February. Unusually clement, as one would say. There have although be some wind thanks to the warm climate. Today I will discuss the scientific discoveries of Jeffrey M Schwartz, gathered together in his fantastic book The Mind and the Brain. And he has an astonishing hypothesis, and that there are actually two things going on with human beings. We usually have a division, brain and body, but he wants to put in another division into an area that has not earlier been acknowledged, and that's between brain and mind. And one of the reasons for that is going on for a long time within neurology and science of cognition, all the way back to William James, who proposed a theory of the mind, of volition, as he said, that it could be something different than brain and matter, and that was volition. There was, however, no scientific foundation to lay such an idea upon. So although we had indications and also moral aspects, because the current reductionism we have makes human beings morally irresponsible. We are not guilty of our own actions. We are born in a certain way. We have the neurons we get by nurture and heritage. So everything is predetermined, and I would say that it's without a doubt the prevalent view. Now within medicine, philosophy as well, my old philosophy teachers have that same idea. Free will is a thing that is impossible to even suggest, and that of course has its implications. And this is what makes Jeffrey M Schwartz unique when it comes to neurologists. We have earlier mentioned some very interesting neurologists like Badre, Tversky, Schmamann, Schmamann. They are all incredibly interesting, and they are showing extraordinary ideas and discoveries coming from neurology. But none of them have this extravagant thinking of Jeffrey M Schwartz. He goes well beyond the pale. It's right out there. There are two starting reasons for that. The first one is already in the 60s, something called the Silver Spring monkeys. There were mainly macaques that one person named Stapp made experiments on. This Stapp went way above and beyond what one could prove in those days, just because he didn't have the proper schooling, the proper education. And the Silver Spring monkeys are the most famous monkeys in any laboratory environment because of the accused maltreatment for them. And that sort of covered or camouflaged the incredible findings that was also made by Taube and assistants in this Silver Spring lab. And one of those were that he accidentally discovered that monkeys giving the right incitement could actually by mere will change their neurological and brainal outlook. They could rebuild neural paths, rebuild whole areas in the brain. Something that Taube didn't know was considered impossible in the 1960s and actually mostly is considered to be impossible up to this day. But the most important thing in this connection is the extent, of course, of Taube's investigation, but also the enormous focus that was put on his investigation, mainly due to the accused maltreatment of the monkeys. It was one of the most testified experiments within neurology, and that makes it more than certain. It makes it very clear that there is a connection between will and neural growth, according to Jeffrey M Schwartz. But he could not propose such a thing. That would be preposterous, actually, and it would lead to the direct firing of a person. This is a thing you can only propose if you have if you left your services, you are no longer dependent on payment from a university or business institution. But you also have to be self-employed in some way to cover the costs for the experimentations. And more to that, there is, as poor old William James, no coverage in science. But here it becomes incredibly interesting, especially for us who's writing the book and our followers, because what Jeffrey M Schwartz did was just beyond the normal one could ask for a medical doctor and a researcher. He actually reached out to scientists of completely different fields. And he contacted the most famous Henry Stapp that we encountered many times here. His book about quantum physics is one of the very best that there are still to this day. Well, to be recommended. He reached out to Henry Stapp in the 90s. They met up, they just prodded their different ideas on each other as a starter. Nothing really happened at the first decade, more or less, but it definitely caught on right at the end of the last millennia, and that happened in San Francisco on Christmas Day. Then both of them realized there is a connection between the workings of the brain and mind and quantum mechanics. It takes volition for the superposition to collapse. So instead of calling it consciousness, which is rather unclear, or observer, it is more apt actually in some ways to call it volition. Volition in that sense, it's not a volition coming from an aggregate of molecules or cells or neural networks or a whole brain. This is volition that does not exist in the pre-existing physical sphere. It's a volition outside of the physical sphere. And you need to taste that, because that's a rather absurd statement. But that was the thing they concluded, Henry Stapp and Jeffrey M Schwartz in San Francisco, Christmas Day, 1999. So you can imagine sort of a surprise for their friends and colleagues into the new millennia. They did not spring the whole thing all of a sudden on anyone, because this needs to be carefully planned. For one thing, you need to have your back covered when it comes to economy. You are sure to lose all your financial support. You need to be self-servant, and as in the case of Henry Stapp, he did not have to fear anything. First, he was in the only subject in all strands of knowledge today, in all educational system and also research system, that partly accept a free will, a volition in the sense I mentioned. Volition not coming from physical extension like molecules, cells, neural networks, or whole brain, or the brain slash body system. And the second is he's long past retirement, so he doesn't need to fear any consequences. He's also well off. Jeffrey M. Schwartz had to make some precautions before he published what he firmly believed in, and that amounts in this enormously densely packed book, The Mind and the Brain. It's a very, very good indication to that volition does actually play a role in the brain, and not the opposite, that the brain constructs volition. All present here today have either the reductive materialism of Daniel Dennett and the Couples Churchland, or what is called epifenomenalism, and that is somehow volition or consciousness or mind is emergent in matter, and it lies dormant in some cases, but once it's aggregated sufficiently, we have all of a sudden some sort of consciousness. The view of Jeffrey M. Schwartz is different from the other one that are covering all views today in different varieties. Of course, renaming is important here if you want to make a name of you, but those renaming always has to be in a certain has to be within the ballpark of decency. Jeffrey M. Schwartz is way beyond the ballpark of decency. He says that volition is something completely unconnected to anything material. It's not an emergent thing. He's not a panpsychist or anything of that sort. So this is wholly different. And I would say this parallels very good what we've been discussing earlier, and from so many different approaches and directions. So this is actually digestible. I think one needs a very firm ground to stand to take this very advanced position of volition being completely free from any material connection in the usual sense in sciences. But there is the training of volition, and that is of course something completely ignored. That is not an important thing, because since it either is a no thing, like in Daniel Dennett, or something emergent from matter, as a very common view today as well, usually panpsychism or something of that sort. We don't have to do actually something. But in the view of Jeffrey M Schwartz, very clear already when they came to the monkeys, this volition need to be trained, and that training is nothing to do with the actual brain cells. We need to, well, they needed to train something that is outside of the whole thing. And that only goes with an enormous amount of repetitions. Enormous. Well beyond what is seen to be necessary today to learn something or to put a habit into it. That's why we normally don't do that. Once we learn something, we don't feel any reason to repeat it any further. We know it, and it's the old view of the world being limited in some sense, that we can learn the world by opening up, by understanding it, and opening up for different subjects, getting more and more information, bits of reality. This is, however, completely different. This is 100% dependent on repetition. 100% dependent on repetition. Volition cannot form without repetition. And of course, the ones who wonder why we in Western culture, in contrast to other cultures, have given up all sorts of repetition. One very good reason, and a valid reason I'd say until now, more or less, where we come in science with Jeffrey M Schwartz et al., is that there is never any space for anything like mind. It's actually impossible to put mind into the equation other as a derivation from brain/matter or something like that sort. Volition can be trained, according to Jeffrey M Schwartz, is excruciatingly hard. He even goes to figure that volition maybe were common earlier on in human history, maybe before the Newtonian revolution or somewhere in the Renaissance, because it's so important for other reasons. We need to survive. That's normal training of volition. A hard life has better chance of giving a strong volition than an easy life. And today we have an easy life. So there is factuality, no need for a will. And also a short life span that they used to have to a high degree. It was more violent. That also helped to put some idea in to train your will, because you see this sort of extension of your own life. Another thing is, to train volition, we need a sufficient calmness of mind, and this is something that is rather unusual these days. I would say even uncommon. Without a calmness of mind, without these automatic thoughts I've been mentioning before, that is recognized also by Badre and Schmamann, there will be no space for a will to sort of grow in. And most of our thinking today are triggered either by internal stimuli by itself, triggering themselves in a sequence like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and action ends with action, and that's automatic. And very common today, we have an incredibly safe environment, and that environment is also planned, and that relocates any will to the outside world. So we don't have to make sure there is food for winter. We don't have to make sure that we're sufficiently well armed so we can defend ourselves against enemies, burglars, robbers, you name it. So that goes a lot of thinking into this, of course. Another thing is the development of the subject, and the subject takes the place of the will. There's another way of explaining the thing from another aspect. The subject is automatic. It's receiving passively by seeing, experiencing the outside world. There is a passivity built into a structure that is millennial, as we discussed loads of times. And by having this gestalt, as I call it, imagery, we will not develop any will because the subject takes the place of volition. So we see loads of good reasons why volition doesn't come into existence anymore, and it's not an existence. There's nothing you can find in the brain that is volition. There are things that, if they are missing, volition will not occur, but that is not the same thing. Do not mix those two things up, because that goes for muddle thinking when it comes to this. Another thing that I think is quite interesting here, and I'm going to add that because this is so interesting, so it needs to go into more. It changes loads more than the whole idea that we have a will. Actually changes the whole ontology. And this is, of course, something that Heidegger always wanted, that he bodily understood. He made margins about that, but he could not put it into words, not even for himself or anyone else, and obviously therefore not in writing. And this is a discovery made by Graham Priest et al., and that's to do with something called paraconsistent logic. In paraconsistent logic, you don't have this gestalt of the mirroring effect of identity. And I'd say, without a very thoroughly thinking into these matters, and I don't mean extensive thinking that you need a lot of information material, but really calm down and really think about it, you will discover that without giving up the mirror gestalt, it's very hard to fathom why a will would be necessary. Because the law, it's not a law, but the identity rule or the identity force that you get from the mirror will obliterate all ideas of volition. Because everything is the same. Everything is the same. Atoms are identical to themselves. That means that our whole makeup is constantly identical. The only difference is the causal effects, cause and effects. But it is identical in that sense. If you track all the cause and effects, and you can go back to the Big Bang or some point further away. And for that to be done, for that to be perceived as being possible, we need to have the mirroring effect. Everything needs to have the possibility of being same. And I'd say this same is one of the reasons volition doesn't occur anymore. Because once you have same, there is no space for figuring or allowing or even pondering about free will. And that could actually be one of the really strong reasons proposing free will today is so horrendously difficult. And I have mentioned often that first time I come across quantum mechanics in university, I hold a micro lecture together with a friend, and I got some compliments afterwards. I don't think it was anything special, but they all said, well, we understood. That was my goal, or our goal. But they all said unanimously, everyone in the class, we even took hand tool on that, it was an interesting idea. And then I asked, is it just an idea? Well, of course it's just an idea. And that was a gut reaction from everyone, and I think that comes from the mirror effect. It's just an idea. Until you start to look into, really seriously into the mirror effect, I think volition still, even if you get sort of proof of it, which is very hard to give in one way, you will not still believe it. But volition is obviously the case when it comes to this animal testing, and there are further evidence that human beings that suffered strokes can actually develop brain features that seem to be impossible, because there are only few who has the will. That's another thing. We need to stay clear of this obstacles against advancing a will. There is this lady, I don't remember her name, I tried to link her. I just heard her yesterday mentioned in this conference we had. 8 people mentioned a book called Mind Strokes, about a woman who developed herself after a massive left hemisphere stroke, and she managed to learn to talk again, which is quite amazing with a left hemisphere stroke at an advanced age. She was 35. She managed to write, yes, write, and she actually managed to once more become a neurologist. It's just beyond belief. You are so handicapped when you lose the ability of a whole hemisphere. And that development was much longer past than the year. We usually give stroke patients 1 year to develop. There will be no development past that year, but she did that. Volition is a rare thing, but it is an actual, actual causal effects. This is what Jeffrey M Schwartz claimed. So you can imagine this is rather interesting for us. Going out on a limb here with most interesting. And the connection with Henry Stapp makes it even more amazing. I had no idea after these fantastic neurologists, all of them, Barbara Tversky, David Badre, Jeremy Schmamann, Jeremy Schmamann, and that lady with motions, that we make our emotions. Who are making the emotions? So we had like 6 or 7 of neurology discoveries, but this is by far the most stringent and advanced. It's a really brave scientist. I can't say anything else. It takes a whole lot of guts to write what he has written, but it makes a lot of sense once you put it all together with chaos theory, quantum mechanics. That's where he gets his support, because it needs a foundation. James could not go that way because quantum mechanics were not discovered when he wrote his book and made his philosophy. And he knew that lack. It was not he could have figured out quantum mechanics would come in the future, But he really wanted to say that volition is something beyond the brain, and he wrote it down actually. And that was the last cue M Schwartz and Henry Stapp needed that Christmas Day of 1999, only a few days before the turn of millennia in San Francisco. And most interesting. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant evening, because we already have darkness here. Take it easy and well, let's get back. Cheers.